Well, hey, friends, welcome to AWKNG's Ask a Scholar podcast. This is where you, the everyday Christian, can get your questions about the Bible answered by a biblical scholar. I'm Carla.
And I'm Mike, and we're both glad that you decided to join our discussion. So let's dive in.
Well, welcome everybody to episode 4, where we are getting your questions answered on the book of Exodus by Dr. Carmen Imes. She is back with us again, and hopefully you got to listen to the last episode with her. It was filled with lots of great content, so I encourage you to go back and listen if you haven't. But Dr. Imes, welcome back. Thank you for joining us for a second episode.
Absolutely glad to be here.
Thank you. Well, let's get started because we've got a list of more questions that we want to try to hit. So I'm going to just jump right in. The first question is interesting because it's about laws. We know the book of Exodus kind of has a lot of chapters covering these different laws. And so the question here, it says, we know that many laws laid out in Exodus are no longer relevant to our time and culture. What are your thoughts on the Sabbath and festivals? Knowing that the Jewish people still celebrate them today, is that something specific to their culture, or should all Christians engage in these things?
Yeah, great question. So I want to get to the question of Sabbath and festivals, but I think it's important for us to start with a sort of pre-question, and that is, what is the purpose of the law in Exodus? In order to get to the place where we could say many of the laws here are no longer relevant, we have some other
Yeah.
work to do. And so I'm the lady whose subtitle of her book says Why Sinai Still Matters. So
Mhm.
I think, I actually think that the Torah and what the laws say in Exodus are still very relevant for us. But the key question is, how do we read them? So many people assume that the Old Testament laws are in place in order for the Jewish people, ancient Jewish people, to get saved. That is, this is how they pleased God so that they could have a relationship with God.
Hmm.
And that's actually a misreading of the book of Exodus. So if you've been reading through Exodus with us, you'll know that the laws do not come in chapter 1 or chapter 2 or even chapter 3. They don't come until chapter 20. And by the time you get to chapter 20, the people have already been rescued, set
Yeah.
free from oppression under Pharaoh's rule. And so the laws are not the means by which they earn the right to be rescued. They're already saved, if you will,
Yeah.
before they get the laws. So the laws are in place, I think, for the fundamental reason of enabling them to fulfill their mission among the nations. In
Okay.
Exodus 19, God appoints his people as his treasured possession, kingdom of priests, and a holy nation. And that role is a representative role so that the nations can watch Israel to find out what Yahweh is like. So they're not doing the laws in order to get saved. The laws are the way they're going to live out their new status as God's treasured people and the people that he's rescued. So with that in mind, when I come to the Old Testament laws, here's what I'm looking for. I want to see, what is the underlying principle behind this laws? What does this law communicate in its ancient context? And then how can I embody that same essence in my context? So there are many laws that don't immediately seem relevant, but they end up being very relevant. So to choose a law from Deuteronomy that's we do similar things with the Exodus laws. There's a law in Deuteronomy that says not to reap to the edges of your field. When you're reaping your harvest, don't reap all the way to the edges, but leave the edges for the foreigner and the widow and the fatherless so that they can come and uh, gather their own grain and have enough food to eat.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not a farmer. I don't have a field. I won't be reaping anything. But the principle behind that is that those who have wealth and the capacity to generate resources need to consider the vulnerable people in our community so that they have access to work that provides for themselves food to eat. So that means that I can think, in whatever field I'm in, I can be thinking about, how can I exercise or exercise stewardship of this wealth in a way that makes space for others to have a living wage. And that, I mean, that just varies from field to field, but
Yeah.
perhaps you're a business owner and you could hire people who might
Mm-hmm.
not be able to pass a background check because they just got released from prison, but they need work so
Yeah.
that they can eat.
Right.
And so that would be a way of not reaping to the edges of your fields
Mm-hmm.
by taking a chance on employing someone and helping them to get back on their feet again. Or perhaps you could provide employment for someone who struggles with mental health issues or with chronic physical health issues that
Mm-hmm.
make it impossible for them to work a regular 40-hour week every week.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe you could have flexible work policies so that they could come work for you when they're able.
Yeah.
That would be another way of not reaping to the edges of your field.
So are you
And
suggesting kind of read through these laws and do your best to apply them to your current context and the
yeah,
context of the culture that you live in?
yeah, and this is hard work, right? Because it involves thinking about the original context
Right.
and what did it communicate then, and how might I communicate the same thing in my context? And we have to be creative, but there are lots of laws that don't seem relevant. You know, you shall not covet your neighbor's ox or his donkey. My neighbors don't have oxen or donkeys, but they do have boats and
Right.
ATVs and
Hmm.
nice cars, right? So we already naturally do the work of translating when we think about that. Like, oh, I know this means I shouldn't covet my neighbor's car, even
Yeah.
though the word car doesn't appear in the Ten Commandments. And I think we can do this on a more robust level by
Mm-hmm.
thinking through the reasons behind the laws. Now, it isn't always possible to figure out why a certain law is there. Some of them are more mysterious, but that doesn't prevent us from trying,
Right.
because the idea is if the ancient Hebrew people were God's covenant people, His treasured possession, and they fulfilled these laws as a way of demonstrating to the nations what God is like. And then Peter takes the same titles and applies them to the church in 1 Peter 2
Mm-hmm.
9 and 10. He
Hmm.
calls the church God's treasured possession, kingdom
Yeah.
of priests, holy nation. Then apparently that covenant is my covenant, and I better be thinking about how to live it faithfully.
Yeah. That's great.
So,
So
with all,
yeah, tell us about the Sabbath and the festivals in
yeah,
light of all that, because that's such great context.
so the Sabbath is funny because of all the 10 commandments, it's the one Christians often will say, so that's the one we don't have to keep, right? And I want to say, okay, let me get this straight. The God of the universe who orders your days has told you he wants you to have a day off every week. And you're saying you don't want it? Like, why wouldn't you want that? So I think we associate Sabbath with legalism.
Yeah.
Maybe it's how you grew up. Maybe you've seen certain versions of Sabbath observance that seemed legalistic. I
Mm-hmm.
think Sabbath is a tremendous gift.
Mm-hmm.
It's a recognition that we have limits,
Yeah.
that we are finite, and that we need to rest in God's provision and not just depend on ourselves.
Yeah.
It's wonderfully restorative. It provides time for families to be together without stress and without that hurry, hurry, hurry that's happening the rest of the week.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, yeah, Sabbath, like find ways to make one day of the week different than every other day
Mm-hmm.
by ceasing from income producing labor and by ceasing from paying attention to your to-do lists
Mm-hmm.
and just letting yourself be with one another and rest. It's
Yeah.
amazing, it's transformative, and I think everybody would be silly to reject this.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me pause here. And Mike, I'm going to ask you to jump in here because one thing that you said, Dr. Imes, is you said pick a day during the week. I know that
Mm,
traditionally, the Jewish people would observe, I think it's Friday sundown to Saturday sundown.
mhm.
Would both of you, I'm curious, both of your thoughts, do you feel that that time frame should be the specific time frame that you practice Sabbath, or is it choose a day? I've heard lots of debate on this, so I'm very interested to hear
Yeah,
y'all's
Mike,
thoughts.
take it away.
Uh,
This was
uh,
unscripted, so
yeah. So this is
enjoy,
yeah. This is
listeners.
I lean more towards of picking a day, to be
Okay.
honest, because I think there's one. I'm not stringent on exactly the time. One, because also just with our Western calendars, we've changed the days and the actual dating of time already a couple of times within Western society. And so if we want to get really be sticklers about the particular day, then that's going to be really hard to determine, considering that even in the middle of the medieval, like during the medieval period, we literally lost a week because we
Hmm.
changed from one type of calendar system to another.
Oh,
And
wow.
so there's that factor that most people don't even consider. I learned this even just
Mm.
during my college classes of just like, wait, we lost a week in our Western calendar. Um, and so like just even for
No
that
wonder
that
I
just
feel
froze.
behind all the time.
Yeah, it just froze in like a little monkey wrench into like those who want to be very like, oh, this is exactly the way that time works. It's like, is it really? Because even scientifically, we know that the Earth doesn't rotate exactly 24 hours. There's a reason why,
Hmm.
even as I was growing up in elementary school, my teachers would tell us like, oh yeah, this is a very special day that's coming up because this only happens every 60, 80 years. We're adding
Mhm.
an extra second to the clock because the Earth is getting slower as it rotates. And
Hmm.
like even just these little things. So I'm not a
Yeah.
stickler for it. I do think that the general principle of having a day of rest is important.
Mhm.
Hmm.
And I mean, Carmen, you've been in Israel, and I got to go there last year for the first time. And
Hmm.
on the day of Sabbath, on Saturday, it was like it was the coolest thing just to kind of just see what was happening. It
Yeah.
took
Yeah.
work for people to get ready for the Sabbath,
Hmm.
but the moment that Sabbath happened, Jerusalem itself, like we were in the city when it finally kicked in, and we were actually going to a dinners at two family homes that they were celebrating Shabbat, and it was just a beautiful time. It was like we were
Hmm.
so honored as foreigners coming in and just being invited to share a meal with Jewish families there,
Yeah.
and just to experience what having like where everyone is essentially taking a load off. They're
Yeah.
enjoying time with their family. They're not
Yeah.
being inundated with notifications from their phones. They're
Hmm.
actually resting. And
Yeah.
it was a really surreal at first, but it was so enjoyable by the end of the evening for us. We were
Hmm.
just so
Yeah.
like people, we were singing songs that we heard
Hmm.
from the table as the family shared, and it was just it was a very memorable time.
Yeah.
And I
There
think
is
it
a
is something that I really would want for myself to become a regular rhythm as well.
Mhm.
there's a sense of palpable joy in Jerusalem on the Sabbath because
Yeah.
Yeah.
you don't hear cars anymore. Like no one's driving on
Yeah.
the roads and the shops are closed and families are present with each other. They're not being pulled in all these different directions. And it's something really beautiful. So, to your question, I would say um, yes, traditionally it's Saturday, Friday night through
Mhm.
Saturday sundown is the Sabbath. The early church switched these observance to Sunday as a way of
Mhm.
commemorating Christ's resurrection. So just as the Exodus started a new calendar for early believers in Jesus, they started reckoning time differently based on the resurrection of Jesus. Like this starts a
Mhm.
new calendar. And I think that's why the shift happened.
Yeah.
There are lots
Mhm.
of people in ministry who cannot rest either on Saturday or Sunday
Yeah.
because of the work that they do.
It's true.
And I would say I think what's most important is for there to be a tangible rhythm in your
Mhm.
home, that there's a day that's different than any other day
Yeah, that's good.
and that you embrace it regularly.
Yeah. Now, the other part of that question was about festivals, and I know I've always kind of seen festivals as just a great time to almost retell the story because each of the
Yeah.
festivals points back to
Mhm.
a key part of the story, and it's a great time to talk to your kids about what this means and engage
Mhm.
them in that. Would you say the same thing, or would you look at things differently when it comes to festivals?
Yeah, I have not been part of a church community that has regularly celebrated Passover or the Feast of Booths or
Yeah.
Day of Atonement. Like, I haven't had that as a regular part of my rhythm, but I'm a fan of the idea.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that it's the telling of the story and remembering that's so important, that we define ourselves around these these events.
Yeah.
A number of years ago, I went to a conference in San Antonio, and my hotel was right next to the Alamo. And I kept thinking, remember the Alamo. Except that's all I remembered. I don't
Yeah.
know who was at the Alamo, what were they fighting about, who won. Like, I literally don't know, because since 5th grade, no one's talked about the Alamo. And
Yeah.
so all I have is this, remember the Alamo. And I think this is what happens to us if we don't keep rehearsing the story.
Yeah.
And the festivals give opportunity to keep those stories alive and for children to be raised in these habits, these
Mm-hmm.
liturgies of identity formation. And
Yeah.
so I'm a fan. I'm not a fan of becoming really stringent about it and saying, like, you're not a Christian if you don't do these things, or you're not doing it
Sure.
right if you. And I think Paul talks about this, right?
Yeah.
He talks about those who celebrate festivals and those who don't, and like
Yep.
leave each other alone. So I think this is an area of Christian freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Um, and it shouldn't become like a prerequisite for spirituality or for salvation. But I do think that as you're able, as you desire, these are
Mm-hmm.
wonderful ways of keeping the story alive.
That's great. Well, I think Mike, you're seems to be shaking your head. Are you in agreement with that?
I,
If
I
so, I'll
would
jump
be
to the next
definitely,
one.
yeah. I mean, I'm definitely in agreement with it, and I think there is. Um, Recently, months ago, when I was preaching a sermon, I actually proposed this idea that the Old Testament scriptures need to be not looked at as like legalistic laws that people had to keep,
Mm-hmm.
but that ultimately the prayer, if I was to think of the Old Testament as a character, that the prayer of the Old Testament was fulfilled in Jesus. And that really
Mm.
the way that we ought to look at the text is essentially not a phone book, but
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
as a family history book
Yeah. I love
that
Mm.
that.
contains
Mhm.
the memories and the lessons, the wisdom
Mm-hmm.
that the people of Israel, and who essentially we are part of that family, we're part of the family of God, that
Right.
this is our shared history.
Mm-hmm. And
And,
why
and
would you not
so
want to look back on that and talk about it?
exactly to
Yeah.
learn and to gain wisdom from that.
Yeah, that's
Mhm.
good. I love that phrase. Awesome. Well, let's
Mm.
jump to one more question, then we'll take a quick break. So this next question is around the significance of all of the items in the tabernacle. And so the person is asking, why are these things so specifically laid out? And God tells them to build in a certain way and use this for a certain
Mhm.
thing.
Mhm.
Any thoughts around the symbolism here? And
Mm.
should we be looking at this deeper?
Yeah, this is a great question. Sometimes people come to the tabernacle instructions and they think, in order for this to make sense or to be significant devotionally,
Mm-hmm.
I have to figure out and find Jesus in every part of this. And
Yeah.
they start reading it kind of almost allegorically, typologically or allegorically. I don't think that's necessary. Now, the book of Hebrews does help us to see the relevance of Christ's sacrifice in light of the tabernacle. But I think when we begin with the tabernacle itself, what we see overall is God is worthy of our best.
Mm.
He's having them make things. This is not a freestyle event. We're not slapping something together. It's not choose your own adventure. God and his sacred holy presence is so majestic that
Mm-hmm.
we need to follow orders because this is something beyond our own understanding and our own comprehension. And so he has the people together bring offerings and then craft the most elaborate furniture and the most elaborate fabrics that any Israelite will have ever seen.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
all of that is a way of showing that God is set apart as holy and as majestic.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have a story, just to anticipate where you're going next in Leviticus. In Leviticus chapter 10, right after the tabernacle set up, the
Mm-hmm.
priests are consecrated, they've offered their first sacrifices. Chapter 10 begins with this little story of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, who decide, hey, we're priests. That means we're like important and we can do what we want. And they take
Mm.
unauthorized fire into the
Yeah.
tabernacle. And at the end of chapter 9, you've just had the successful inauguration of the tabernacle, and the presence of God has come down, and
Mm-hmm.
fire comes out from the presence of God and burns up the sacrifice on the altar.
Yeah.
And in chapter 10, the same fire comes out from the presence of God and burns up Nadab and Abihu, as if to
Hmm.
say, hey, everybody,
Yeah.
please note, this is not a freestyle event.
Yeah.
You do not get to just do whatever you want when you waltz into my presence. You have to come humbly as
Mm-hmm.
someone under orders who is doing things precisely as God designed or
Mm-hmm.
God commanded.
Yeah, and truly set
So,
apart.
yes, and so yes, all of the pieces of furniture are important because they function in particular ways. The altar, of course, is where the certain parts of this animals that are sacrificed are offered up in smoke as a pleasing aroma to God. So
Mm-hmm.
there's this kind of translation of body parts of animals like fat and certain meats that get transposed into the heavenlies by becoming smoke.
Mm-hmm.
So that happens on the altar. The bronze laver where they wash themselves signify the purification of the priests. The tent that they go into has a lampstand in it, and the lampstand provides a very functional purpose of making it light enough in there to see, because these are heavy curtains and it would be really dark inside. But there's also a sense of you're coming into the light of God's presence.
Mm-hmm.
There's a table with 12 loaves of bread on it in the tabernacle, and those 12 loaves symbolize the 12 tribes of Israel. And there they are, as Michael Morales says, basking in the light of God's presence all week long. Like they're being consecrated by being in close proximity to the divine presence, which symbolizes what is true of the whole nation. They also become holy by
Mm-hmm.
being in the presence of God and basking in his presence. There's an incense altar that the priests will burn sweet smelling incense on, and this incense is not allowed to be used anywhere else. Similarly, Aaron's clothes, the high priest's clothing, is so elaborate that no Israelite is dressed as well as he is. So he's set apart. He is the best dressed Israelite, which shows how seriously we need to take this whole apparatus, this whole and the worship of Yahweh. And then, of course, in the most holy place is the Ark of the Covenant, this chest. We now understand that chests like this one on carrying poles were very, very common in Egypt, and they were used to transport idols of gods from one place to another. And so it would have been a very natural symbol for the Israelites to say, oh, the divine presence is among us,
Mm-hmm.
and we're carrying the covenant tablets with us as a symbol of this agreement that we've made with God, that we're in treaty with him. And so all of this contributes to this greater picture of God's holiness
Mm-hmm.
and of the both access to God's presence and it's a restricted access, like you can come but don't come too close,
Right.
which acknowledges the danger of God's presence and the sinfulness of humanity. So
Mm-hmm.
it's at the same time gracious. It's gracious that God set up boundaries because he
Yeah.
doesn't want people accidentally getting zapped.
Right.
But
And
it's
it
also
also
gracious.
it kind of instills a fear of the Lord too in the
It
people as
does.
well. So it helps constantly keep that in front of them so they don't just get,
Yes.
lackadaisy.
Totally. Totally. And it's also gracious because the presence of God that was on the mountain so visibly, fire and smoke and clouds, has now come and taken residence in a tent.
Hmm.
And this is a time when all of them live in tents. So God
Yeah.
has moved into the neighborhood. He's going to go
Hmm.
forward with them. They don't have to hike back to Sinai every time they want to pray or ask God something.
Right.
Like he's come down into their midst to travel with them. And so that's really a beautiful picture.
Yeah, very much so. Mike, any additional thoughts on that before we head to a break?
Just one thought is that as well, like, because I've always thought with the covenant, with the tabernacle, but also later on with the temple, was that this was also like these foreshadowings of this is a little bit of Eden, of like a recapturing of Eden
Mm-hmm.
again.
Hmm.
Because like
Yes.
even the way that the lampstands and how they're described and being created, like
Yeah.
why
Mm-hmm.
do they have to look like flower? Like why do they
Right.
have to look
Trees.
like
Yeah.
almond
Trees with
blossoms?
flowers.
And
Yep.
yeah, like why do they have to look like that? Like what is this like garden like imagery that's being used
Mm-hmm.
here
Mm-hmm.
for? Unless this is almost like a little hint of like, yes, we lost Eden, but Eden is ironically now being carried around by the Israelites in a very small
Yeah.
amount of space, but
Mm-hmm.
it's
Yeah.
the place where heaven and earth meet.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
And
Mm-hmm.
and
so like
it says
yeah,
this
it's an act of grace.
explicitly, and it says this explicitly in Leviticus that surrounding the tabernacle, God says, I will walk among them and be their God, and they will be
Hmm.
my people. And so there's an explicit reference to that, being able to walk among them again, like God walked in the garden with Adam and Eve. So the loss of presence in Genesis 3 is being
Mm-hmm.
recovered in at the end of Exodus, when the presence of God comes and fills the tabernacle. It's a really significant moment theologically. So we might feel like, oh man, these are long, boring chapters. They don't really have any relevance, but they're so important to the biblical writers, and
Yeah.
that's why they get the whole, you have chapters 25 to 31 with all the instructions, and then starting in chapter 35 all the way to 40 of all of the building of the parts according to the instructions, because it's so important to follow orders and do it right, because we want this
Yeah.
to work. We want God to dwell among us. So yes, there's Christological significance here, because Christ came and dwelt among us in the
Mm-hmm.
flesh. The tabernacle was great, but Christ is even greater because
Right.
he's among us in the flesh.
Man, what a beautiful picture that is. I love the semblance
Mm-hmm.
there. Well, let's jump to a quick
Yeah.
break and then we'll come back for last few questions on Exodus and then we'll wrap up. If you're not already reading with us, we'd love to have you start reading today. Every month in the Awakening Bible community, we read a book or several books of the Bible together. Readings are only 1 to 3 chapters a day, 5 days a week, with weekends reserved for catch up or deeper study. And as you read, we know that you will likely encounter questions, but that's where we come in. Submit your questions at AWKNG.com, and we will do our best to get them answered for you right here on the Ask a Scholar podcast. Awesome. Well, welcome back, everybody. We've got just a couple of last final questions on the book of Exodus. So let's jump right in and get to it. The first question here is, why did Aaron specifically make a calf for the idol that the Israelites worshipped?
Yeah, so this baffled me for a long time. But a few months ago, I got to go on a trip to Egypt, and I'm just trying to pull up my pictures here to remind myself. There are so many ways that the the stories of Exodus, the design of the tabernacle, and everything reflect Egyptian background.
Mm-hmm.
And this is another example of that. So in Egypt, there were several different cow deities.
Okay.
One of the key ones was Hathor, who was often seen as like a guardian deity. You can find statues of Hathor in tombs where the person who died is like standing under the head of the cow, and the whole body is behind it. The sun god Ra was also pictured as a calf or a bull. And
Hmm.
so it's possible that the Israelites are here resorting to what they saw in Egypt. They're trying to find something that represents this sort of young energy of a young bull who would be able to carry them forward. Um, Canaan also has a a bull god. Of course, Baal is
Mm-hmm.
symbolized as a calf or a bull. And in Mesopotamia, we have the storm god Adad or Adad, who's pictured riding a bull. And
Hmm.
so it doesn't matter which context you're looking in, this is a very common symbol for deities. So it seems like they're falling back on what they know,
Mm-hmm.
whether it dates back to their time in Canaan, or whether it reflects a later period, or whether it's Egyptian. But what's, I think, saddest about this is that in Genesis, God had appointed humans as his tselem,
Mm-hmm.
his image. And that's, an image is a three-dimensional representative of the presence of God. And here, the people are trading away their identity as God's image and
Yeah.
appointing some statue to take their place.
Mm-hmm.
God wants humans to represent him as animate beings.
Mm-hmm.
And here they're trading that away. So not only are they diminishing God's glory by making a calf, but they're diminishing their own status that God has
Hmm.
appointed them to.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty heavy when you think of it like that. Mike, any
Mm-hmm.
thoughts?
I mean, I was going to bring up the whole entire concept of Baal and the bowl as well, because
Mm-hmm.
if I'm not mistaken, Carmen, the Hittites were part of they were sort of one of the vassal states of the Egyptians as well
Mm-hmm.
during this time period, and so like just that the bowl imagery is just part of the whole entire pantheon of all the different regions. There was always going to
Yeah.
be some sort of image of a god or a deity
Yeah.
that looks like a bull or a young calf. And so
Yeah.
it's not completely surprising when we factor that in. I think
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
the sad bit is also when Aaron, after he creates the calf, he declares out to Israel that here is your God or gods, however you want to like go
Yeah.
with the word Elohim there, but
Mm-hmm.
Right.
basically attributing their salvation, their deliverance from the Egyptians to
Yeah.
this now golden idol that they created from the very gold that Yahweh had allowed them to pillage essentially from their slave
Hmm.
owners.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
It is sad. I've often wondered, and I'm not this far yet in my commentary writing, so I'll probably have more opinions on this later, but I've often wondered, what is Aaron trying to do? Is
Yeah.
he feeling sort of pushed and pulled into this, and now he's trying to salvage it by saying, look, here's Yahweh. Like we're going to try to baptize this moment of idolatry by saying it's Yahweh. Or
Mm-hmm.
is he imagining that Yahweh rides the bull? So this is just Yahweh's transport,
Hmm.
like the Mesopotamian pictures that you see of
Mm-hmm.
Adad riding the back of a bull. It's possible that he's trying to salvage it, but it doesn't work. The people are
Right.
not worshiping Yahweh, and so this is the wrong direction to go. And then if we fast forward later in Israel's history, King Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom after the split,
Yeah.
Mhm.
after Solomon dies, his first act as king is to set up two golden calves, one at Dan in the north and one at Bethel in the south. And he repeats Aaron's words. He says, "Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt."
Yeah.
And it's like he's having this moment of historical nostalgia. Like, let me retrieve something from our past and bring it forward so that we can justify our existence and we can put God's stamp of approval on this kingdom. And he is picking the wrong
Mm-hmm.
incident.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mike, anything else you wanted to share? You were shaking your head, so I didn't know.
No, yeah, I'm in absolute agreement. It's just also just like, because, Dr. Johnson and I have been going through the book of Genesis, like Bethel is such an important site.
Mm,
And the fact that,
it is.
this king sets up a golden calf, a golden idol in
Mm-hmm.
sort
Yeah.
of nostalgia and of echoing what Aaron had done.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, like he essentially took a spot that was revered as a place where God met their forefathers, and now it became a site of pagan worship.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
just like it's
it's
just
really sick.
immensely sad.
Yeah.
Yeah. It really is.
Man. Wow. Well, even though that's really sad, let's move to the next
Let's
question.
do.
Let's see if we can bring up the mood a bit. So this is our final question on the book of Exodus, and I think it's a good one. It reads in Exodus 33.
Mm,
What is the glory of God that Moses wants to see?
mm. Yeah. Moses asks God, "Show me your glory."
Exactly.
Mhm.
I love this scene because it's such a different Moses than the one we met in chapter 3.
Mm-hmm.
In chapter 3, God tries to commission Moses to go back to Egypt and rescue the people. And Moses has 5 different objections that he
Yeah.
raises trying to get out of this.
Yeah.
And when he says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" God's response is, "I will be with you." And Moses just sort of throws that away and he's like, "Yeah, well, I'm still not going." And by the time we get to the end of the book, Moses is not willing to take another step if it means
Mm-hmm.
going without Yahweh. And
Yeah.
so in this scene, Yahweh has said, "Okay, these people are rebellious. If I go along, I might kill them on the way." So I better stay here and I'll just send an angel with you. And Moses says, no, if your presence does not go with us, do
Yeah.
not send us up from here. Now, I've been watching videos of Mount Sinai and like people hiking around Mount Sinai because I'm about to visit for the first time in a couple weeks. And I want to know what to expect. And let me just say, I cannot imagine choosing to stay there. Like there is nothing green. There are no trees. There's no shade.
Mm.
This is a very desolate place. And for Moses to have gotten to the place where he
Wow.
doesn't want to take another step if it takes him away from the presence of God just shows us how transformed he's been by being in God's presence.
Yeah.
And I think Moses has the sense that he's only seen a bit of it. Like there's so much more to God that he might be missing. And so he's like, show me your glory. Like I want more of you. And by the way, I'm not leaving unless you come with me.
Yeah.
And so we often think of glory as brightness or like glowing, maybe like clouds on fire or something. And there is a sense in which when God shows his glory, it is like a cloud on fire. Like there is a sort of visible manifestation. But glory has more to it than that. It also relates to honor. That God has acted in such a way that he is worthy of our honor. And so to say, show me your glory might even mean show me your ways on earth so that I can see how honorable you are. Like show me more of the extent of your honor.
Yeah. Well, and as you're talking, I just think about how much Moses saw through the deliverance, out of Egypt. And so now when he gets to this section, his faith is so built up that he's just like, I can never go back. I can't unsee what I saw. I can't not relive these experiences. And so he's desperate because he knows what he's seen. And it just makes me think how often in our own lives, we have to recount what the Lord has done, because when we do that, our faith is built. We realize right then and there that, okay, wait, I can move forward, but only if the Lord is with me, because I know what he did before. It's such a beautiful picture.
Yeah. And can we get to that place in our lives where we don't want to take another step if it's going to take us outside of the will of God?
Right.
That we only want that job, or we only want that move, or we only want to marry this person if the Lord is in it.
Yeah.
And if it's going to bring us closer to the presence of the Lord. And if there's any chance that it would take us off track, that's not what we want.
So touch a little bit more on the honor concept, because I don't know if I'm fully tracking with what you were saying there.
Yeah, so here I'm thinking of the work of Haley Goranson Jacob. She wrote her dissertation under N.T. Wright on Romans, and her book, let me think of what it's called.
Your wall of books that you read on your free days off that we learned last episode.
These are the ones. Okay, I don't have her book title in my head. It's about glory. So people can look it up. But she talks about glory in Romans and how it's not just light, but it's also honor. Like there's a kind of weightiness to what God has demonstrated his character to be.
Okay.
So it's like Moses wants to understand the ways of God or the character of God. Like, show me more of who you are is kind of the heart of that.
Yeah, more of the intimate relationship side.
Yeah. And so my friend Austin Searles wrote his dissertation on the divine name in Exodus. And we already touched earlier on, or in the previous episode, actually, on the name of God and how that plays out in the book. But it is like a placeholder at the beginning, like I am who I am, or I will be whoever I will be. And the more that unfolds in God's behavior and God's action through the book, the more we see his glory. So if somebody didn't know who I was and they heard, oh, it's Carmen Imes on this podcast, I don't know who Carmen Imes is. It would not help that person to pick a baby name book off the shelf and look up Carmen, because if you did, you would find, oh, it's a Latin name that means song. Right. And you'd say, oh, maybe she's going to sing for us. I don't know. And so I'm not going to sing, But as you listen through our conversation, you find out more and more about what makes Carmen tick. Who is
Yeah.
Carmen? We find out each other. We come to know each other not by knowing the etymology of our name, but by knowing how we act and what gets us excited.
Mm.
So you now know a lot about me and my nerdy love for the book of Exodus. And in the same way, Moses is asking to see more of what it means. Who is Yahweh? And
Mm.
Yahweh's glory would include all of his reputation and all of his honor. So Moses wants to encounter that more fully than he has already to this point.
I love that. Mike, any thoughts?
I love everything that you mentioned, Carmen, and I think there's the interesting the way that I was approaching to answer this question is going off from verse 11, the moment before all this, where it says, "Thus the Lord," or Yahweh, used to speak to Moses face to face, and
Mm,
then when you get into this conversation, please show me your glory. The
mm,
way that Yahweh responds back to him and says, "But," he said, "you cannot see my face,
mm,
for man shall not see me and live." And it's
Mm.
it's not just simply like, I want to learn more about you. It's almost as though Moses is saying, I actually really want to see you. Yes, your honor, your
mm,
glory, your
mhm.
everything about who you are. I actually want to
Yeah,
know you. And
yeah,
thus it represented by the idea of seeing, Yahweh's face, of
mm,
actually knowing a person by seeing them face to face,
Mm.
right? Like,
yeah.
when this podcast comes out, right, folks will hear the audio version of the podcast, but then if they go to the YouTube channel, they'll be able to see our faces, and so they'll
Right.
actually be
Mhm.
able to identify Carmen Imes with the face that they see, and
Mm-hmm.
thus
Yeah,
even
yeah,
a sense of knowing more from that.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's also another dimension to that, Mike, that I'll just add, because when I was in Egypt in January, we went to lots of temples and tombs, and often what you'll find is a stone relief, a stone image of a pharaoh face to face with a deity. They're like, you're seeing them in profile, so it's like their noses are right up, almost touching each other, this
Mm,
face to face relationship. And there's a sense in which the average Egyptian doesn't get to talk to Ra or Amun
Mm-hmm.
Re or whatever deity, but only the pharaoh has that kind of intimacy with the
Huh.
gods and is that and that personal of a relationship. And so this face to face relationship that Moses has and wants with Yahweh actually puts him in a position like Pharaoh's, where he's leading the people from that place of having special access to divine presence.
Mm.
mm.
Interesting. I've never heard that. Wow.
Yeah, that one was new. Our guide
Yeah.
was really excited to show us, and we're like, "Oh,
Yeah. Wow.
okay,
That's awesome. Well, thank you again for being with us. This has been such just a great conversation. The last podcast episode and this one, and I know that whoever listens is really going to get a lot out of it. I got a lot out of it. I wish I had a
good."
notebook to where I could take notes. I'm going to have to go back and listen. But quickly touch on your books that you touched on last time, just in case
Mhm.
people didn't listen last time. I want you to show those really quick, and then we're going to ask you one final fun question.
Okay, so there's Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters, which is where I talk about the purpose of the law. And then if you want the scholarly version, there's Bearing Yahweh's Name at Sinai, a reexamination of the name command of the Decalogue. And the reason I said being by accident is because I have another book called Being God's Image, Why Creation Still Matters. We touched on this a little bit with the talk about image.
Yeah.
And this was actually one of Dr. Heiser's last Facebook posts was this book cover. It had just come. His
Oh.
copy had just arrived. He got an early copy before it was released, and he wanted to read it and talk about it with me, and we never got the chance to do that. So
Oh.
it's too bad. And then we have Illustrated Exodus in Hebrew, which has the full text of Exodus in Hebrew with illustrations. It's lots of fun. And people can watch for my Exodus commentary with Baker Academic coming out maybe in 2026.
Yes.
And until then, I have weekly YouTube videos called Torah Tuesday that people can check out.
And can they find that just by searching Torah Tuesday? Is that how they find that?
Yes, or you can plug in my name, Carmen
Okay.
Imes, and it should come up. And I'm actually talking through my commentary. So as I write it, I make YouTube videos sharing the most important parts. So it's kind of like a visual commentary.
That's awesome. Well, I will definitely say those that are listening, check that out because that'll be a great resource just as you finish the book of Exodus, or if you're catching up and still reading through it, that'll be awesome. Well,
Mm-hmm.
thank you again. Let's ask you one final fun question, which is what is your favorite thing to eat? It can be sweet, it can be salty. What's your favorite thing?
When I think of like going out to dinner, I would always pick curry,
Oh,
either
okay.
Thai curry or Indian curry. I like them both.
Okay, awesome. That's
Yeah.
great. Well, thank you guys for joining us for this episode. Remember, you can like, share, subscribe, leave us a review. All those things help. And make sure that you get ready for the book of Leviticus, which we're going to read next. And go online to our website, submit your questions as you read, and stay tuned for the next couple of episodes that we have coming out as we cover the book of Leviticus. If you're enjoying the Ask a Scholar podcast, click follow on your podcast listening app to subscribe. Want to help further our mission? Consider becoming a monthly partner at AWKNG.com and help us make an impact in the lives of others all around the world as we work to make biblical understanding accessible to all with no exceptions. Join us next time as we get more of your Bible questions answered. And don't forget to visit AWKNG.com to engage in all our biblical resources that we offer.